Okay, today we're going over Chapter 17 in Principles of Crop Production, which is about harvesting. And harvesting grain crops, there's like at different, it's important to get the right stage. The stage of physiological maturity is a stage of development when the maximum accumulation of dry matter in the seed has occurred. And so naturally, if the grain would happen to be harvested before physiological maturity, the yield is reduced because it hasn't put on as much, tissue and dry matter as it could. And moisture content is also an indicator of physiological maturity. This is from your book, so I won't read it over in detail, but it just shows the moisture contents of different crops at physiological maturity, and then later on for harvest, market, and storage. And you can see that there's certain like a certain percentage that actually at physiological maturity, but it's got to be drier in order to be ready for harvest and market and those other things. And once again, that's for the north. It might be different in the south. And there's visual indicators of physiological maturity. We've gone over these in other chapters, so I won't go into too much in depth with them. You might want to look back at the pictures of some of the stages so you know what to look for. The black layer of corn and sorghum is the dark layer that forms at the base of the kernel, and it just means that there's no longer, carbohydrates are no longer moving into the seed, so the seed has, got all the sugar development that it's going to have. And then the milk line in corn, that's one thing that forms on the smooth side of the kernels as corn is approaching maturity. And it's the boundary between the starch and the liquid portions of the seed. And when the milk line is no longer visible and you can't squeeze liquid from the corn any longer, it's at physiological maturity. And then soybeans, when they lose their green color, the pods lose their green color, that's the indicator of maturity in soybean. The pod is what contributes the sugar to the developing seed. And so when the pod has become yellow and brown, it's no longer actively growing green, so it's a sign of seed drying and shrinkage. And then on small grains, when the awns and the glumes, other modified leaves that surround the grain, when they turn yellow from green to yellow, it's a sign of maturity. And in sunflowers, the seeds are physically mature when the back of the head is no longer green and starts turning yellow. And it's important that grain be, at the correct stage of moisture before harvest, because dry seed is less susceptible to microorganisms, more easily disseminated by the plant. It comes off the plant easy. And when a seed is first formed, it's almost 90% water. And as the seed develops, there's more dry matter packed in. Moisture content decreases. And when the seeds are at physiological maturity, they're still too dry for storage. You can end up with moldy seeds or other diseases, other problems. And the seeds dry faster as the temperature is warmer, and also with airflow or decreasing humidity, just common sense kind of. And so the goal of harvesting is to remove the crop from the field with minimal losses. Harvest maturity is the moisture content of the crop when a combine can harvest the grain with minimal field loss. And so corn is harvested when at about 25 grain moisture level, and the plant would be brown or tan, but it still has leaves. And if you harvest at greater than 25, you would end up with losses because the ears are not snapped off the plant easily. The corn doesn't shell completely. And at less than 25, plant is more susceptible to lodging, ear drop, and other things. And soybeans are harvested directly from the field at about 13%. And that's when the leaves have dropped and you only see a dried stem with pods. And harvest losses of 10% or more are not uncommon. Losses come from shattering of the beans and the fallen stalks that can't be picked up. So it's with a plant like soybean, it's natural you can't prevent loss completely. And some things like canola, you even lose more. It shatters so easily. And so it depends on the type of plant and, other characteristics. And then small grains are allowed to usually dry standing and, if possible, combine directly or else swathed before harvest. use swathing if there's either like a variation in maturity of the crop or if there's a significant weed problem. So if you've got green weeds going into the combine at the same time as the crop, they have lots of moisture in them. They can either plug the threshing units or they can just also, cause problems with, in the stored crop later on. And swathing can also counteract the risk of lodging, because if you're going to cut it down before it has a chance to fall over. And the next few slides just talk a little bit about the history of harvest. So in the early days of agriculture, all crops were harvested by hand. Things like the, picture, the sickle, scythe, and cradle were used for small grains until the 1800s. And the grain was cut, it was picked up, loaded onto a wagon, and taken to a stationary thresher where the threshing was done manually. And then during the 1800s, the reaper was invented. It was a horse-drawn machine that cut labor in half. The reaper would deposit the cut grain on the field, and it would be manually collected. And later the reaper was modified to allow that, so the operator could use some of the straw to bind grain bundles together. Then later on, automatic binders were developed that used wire and twine to tie the bundles together. Those were called sheaves, and they were stacked in the field to dry. And then later on, they were taken to a thresher that would separate the grain from the chaff. And corn was also harvested by hand. The ears would be picked, and the stover, that's everything left over after the ears are picked, the husks, leaves, and stalks. Those were tied into big bundles, which were left in the field to dry. And that was used for livestock feed and other things. So after picking corn all day, it took the worker about a day or so to husk the corn after harvest. It was really labor-intensive process. Nowadays, in places that use, mechanized agriculture, all grain crops are usually harvested by combining. So in the past, like cutting, gathering, threshing were separate operations, and that took a lot of time and labor. And I know my grandmother talking about the threshing crew coming to work, it'd probably be, 10 or 15 people, depending on the size of the farm, would come and work for days and then move on. But a combine harvester with cuts, gathers, threshes, and uses screens and fans to clean the grain, that's why it's called a combine. And then the grain is collected in a hopper till it can be transferred to a transport vehicle. And the straw, leaves, other stuff comes out the back. And that can be scattered, or it can be placed in windrows for pickup and baling. Like if you have a cattle operation, a lot of people bale the straw and then they use it for animal bedding. And there's if the combine is not properly adjusted, a large amount of grain will also go through the machine, or the grain can be damaged. So you have to be careful about the adjustment. And then back to drying grain for harvest. Grain's usually marketed at an optimal bushel weight and moisture content. And because if it's sold at moisture levels above the established limits, farmers will be docked or receive less money because, the elevator knows it's going to shrink in storage, or possibly develop diseases and stuff. A seed is a living organism, and there's still biological processes going on that are affected by temperature and moisture. And so if there's too much moisture, the seed starts doing respiration, which a seed will do when it's trying to grow, except in this case, you don't want it to try to grow. That would cause, the seed will start breaking down the stored carbohydrates, and, basically, once again, the seed's trying to grow at a time when you don't want it to grow. And also raising the grain's temperature. Higher temperatures can lead to fungus growth. And so if you have very high moisture levels with no air flow, that you can end up with fermentation reactions inside the bin and end up with spoiled grain. And there's different methods of drying grain. So field drying is just drying standing unharvested crops in the field, letting them dry to the correct moisture as much as you can before harvesting. And because moisture will evaporate from the kernel through the husks or the glooms, whatever. And corn and soybean can lose up to 1% moisture per day during good drying conditions. And this is a natural low-energy process. You don't have to do anything. Just let it, with the right weather and whatever, you can let it, just let it happen. But if you have untimely, cool, wet weather or rain at the wrong time, can delay harvest. And but the problem is, as standing crops dry, there might be greater loss due to seed shattering, lodging, other things. There's a couple of types of fungi that can grow on standing corn that can produce toxins that are harmful to humans and animals. And you can also use artificial drying. It's when the grain is harvested, stored in a bin or a pile and dried using a big fan or a heater. And you have to factor in the costs of propane, electricity, other things that can add an additional cost, to production cost, depending on the method and how wet the crop is to start with. And then storage. Quality will never improve during storage. The best you can hope for is that it's not going to go down too much, because you just want to minimize loss, maintain the color, purity, everything else, and also maintain viability of the seed if it's used for planting. And factors in maintaining quality, temperature, moisture, and storage time. And fungi are the most, molds and things like that are the most frequent cause of loss of quality during storage. And losses can increase as moisture levels increase because fungi will grow faster. And you can also end up decreasing the seed viability, discoloration, changes in seed, toxic compounds called mycotoxins. And there's different fungi that, Aspergillus, Penicillium, and several others are, the ones that are likely to cause problems during storage. And the spores are found on harvest equipment, walls of storage bins. They're everywhere in the dirt. So minimum temperature for growth of storage fungi is 40 degrees Fahrenheit, with the optimal temperatures are higher, 80 to 90 degrees, but they will grow at as low as 40 degrees. Insects, certain types of insects can also cause significant problems in stored crops. There's some that they eat stored seeds and contaminate the grain with either with insect parts or their feces. And there's certain ones called the granary weevil, sawtooth grain beetle. They're fairly small insects but they will cause a lot of trouble if you have a large infestation of them. Rodents like rats and mice are mainly a problem in an unsealed storage container. If it's sealed properly, they have a hard time getting in. But it doesn't take much of a hole for a rat or a mouse to get in. And so as far as harvesting forages, forages are just like a vegetative part of plants that are used as livestock feed, things like hay, just that are harvested. They can either be eaten by grazing livestock or can be removed as hay or silage for feeding later. And so if you're harvesting, the goal is to harvest while retaining as much of the nutrient quality as possible. But you can have losses of 25% or higher, especially for hay that has to be cut and dried in the field. Losses that here are higher than for grain because the leaves often separate from the stem, can blow away or lost in the field. Maybe they don't get picked up, maybe it rains on it when it's laying there to dry or something. And yield of forage is measured in tons per acre. And hay normally contains 15% moisture or less. Silage contains about 60% moisture, just because from the difference in the drying and storage process. And quality of forage or the feeding value is based on, the three components are intake is how much the animal will eat. Nutritive value is the nutrient content, and anti-quality factors are things like chemical toxins that might make it taste bad or make animals sick if they do eat it. And these are all influenced by the amount of cell wall structural material a forage contains. Lignin is like the stuff wood is made of, but it's also part of cell walls. And it's indigestible and interferes with utilization of cellulose and hemicellulose, and those, animals can get energy from those. But if there's too much lignin, it'll interfere with that. And so higher cell wall content is associated with reduced intake, digestibility, and nutrient content. And then also when to harvest, so as the crop matures, the yield increases, but as it gets further along in maturity, the quality will decrease because more mature plants tend to have thicker leaves and more fibrous stems. So you'd want to harvest at the stage, where you will have the largest amount of yield with the highest quality. Just work that out for the individual plant. And then so stages of forage legumes. These are similar to the stages of soybeans and other legumes. So the vegetative stage is leaves but no buds or flowers. And the bud stage is buds but no open showy flowers. First flower, just the first flowers are starting to be present. The flowering, multiple flowers are present, and seed or post-flowering, you see pods, green and mature pods, and there may still be some flowers on the stem. And then stages of grasses that are planted for forage. They're similar to, once again, wheat or some of the other grasses. But vegetative is just leaves and no stem development, just the very beginning, little grass leaves. And then stem elongation, when you see the elongation of stems, but there's no flowers or inflorescence. The boot stage is when the inflorescence is enclosed in the flag leaf, similar to on wheat. And then flowering is when the flowers start, and anthesis, flowers start shedding pollen and fertilization occurs. The milk stage, look, seeds are formed but are immature, and you can squeeze them and milky juice come out. Dough stage, you can no longer squeeze the juice out of the seeds, but they're still soft. And ripe seed is a mature seed with a brown coating. And as far as grazing, there's different ways, different patterns where ways you can have the animals graze the pasture. Continuous stocking would be like, basically the animals are just turned into they have the free run of the whole area for a certain period, either, for the whole season or until they've grazed enough so they need to be moved to a different pasture. Rotational stocking is just when you divide the pasture into paddocks, separated by fence or whatever, and, have the animals, rotate from one to the other throughout the season. And strip grazing, you just divide into narrow strips and then let them graze all one strip and then move on to the next before moving on to the next. And creep grazing is when the calves are allowed to graze ahead of the cows, and that way the calves are most likely to get the best, high quality food that they need for growth. And stocking rate is really important with grazing. That's just the number of animals per acre. And it's going to depend on the type of animal, and then also the species, the plant composition of your pasture. So at lower stocking rates, the animal performance increases because the animals can select the best plants with the highest forage quality. But as the stocking rate increases, selectivity decreases because they're just trying to get enough to eat, and they may not all be able to get the plants that they want or the plants that they kind of seek out for the best food value. And so total weight gain of the animal increases until there's too little forage left to support the herd. And that can happen with a midsummer drought. So at that point, they'd have to be moved to another pasture or find another source of feed. So you'd want to have, kind of balance you want to have enough animals, as many animals as you can without decreasing without overgrazing the pasture, or without maybe when the amount of weight gain actually drops because they're not getting enough of what they need. And then hay is forage, dried 15% moisture and stored in the air. And alfalfa is the leading hay crop in the United States, but there's lots of other legumes that can be used, some of the clovers and also some grasses. A lot of hay fields are a mixture of legumes and grasses. And the reason for the low moisture is because if it's stored above 20%, it can mold, and that can lead to loss of quality, possible problems, diseases for the animals that eat it. So there's 4 steps to hay making. First, cutting. The plants are cut, leaving 1 to 3 inches of stubble on the ground. Deposited windrows are just fluffed rows of forage that, to increase airflow. They had airflows necessary for drying. And most of the modern mowers have a conditioning unit that crushes the stem that if it's crushed, it'll dry faster. Then it's dried in the field 1 to 4 days, depending on the temperature and the sun, wind, other things. And if necessary, it can be raked or turned over, so the bottom will dry. But if it does happen to rain during the drying process, it can extend the time. And if there's enough rain, it can cause leaf loss and possibly leaches out the nutrients, or maybe the plants will start to spoil. Then baling. In the old days, they would just remove the loose hay from the field and stack it. And now hay balers lift the dried hay into a chamber that compresses it and wraps it up with twine or net. And then they're transported from the field in a wagon or truck, flatbed or something, and unloaded and stored. And if the bales are left too long in the field, they can be damaged by rainfall, and they can also interfere with regrowth because, depending on the season, you want to get the plants growing again. If there's too many bales left out there, they can interfere with that. And if hay is stored in a barn, it can continue to lose moisture to a level about 5%. And then silage is actually stored anaerobically, means without oxygen, at usually moisture above 60%. And it's stored in a sealed structure, usually, you want to exclude air and keep out rain or snow. But silage actually needs high moisture content, for growth of the beneficial bacteria that are needed for the process, and also you have to compact it to exclude air. And it's actually preserved by the low pH that develops, and that's caused by organic acids during the fermentation process. And fermentation can't take place if there's air, if there's oxygen. So lactic acids, develops and reduces the pH to 4.5 or below. And basically the forage is basically pickled and preserved. Like you make pickles, they're preserved at a low acid pH too. And that's important because it inhibits the growth of the fungi, bacteria, and yeast that might cause spoilage. If the pH doesn't go low enough, those things will still grow. And then the different types of silage, depending on whether it can be made from corn or hay. And if it's corn silage, it's just been finely chopped whole corn plants. And it's usually, if it's harvested for silage, it's immature relative to that's harvested for grain. Moisture level of 60% or more, 65% or more. And corn silage is a very high energy feed that can produce high levels of weight gain or milk production in animals. And then hay silage is made from the same plants that are usually made into hay. And it's a little bit lower in energy, higher in fiber and protein. And there can be 3 types: direct cut, which is 75 to 85% moisture. That's just cut and chopped in the field, usually the same day. And because of the high moisture, there's less field loss. But there can also be storage loss because of incomplete fermentation. Wilted silage is dried in the field until a certain target moisture is reached, and then it's mechanically picked up and chopped. And drying time can be like 4 to 8 hours. And then haylage is the driest form of hay crop silage. It's difficult to preserve and it can spoil because it's harder to pack and exclude air. And this is what it's often made in the tower type silos. And there's other methods of storing silage. Baleage is just individual big bags of baled silage wrapped in plastic. So that would be just like individual bags. And silo bags are big bags, long bags like these. And then also just in compacted piles or bunkers. That's the way I'm most familiar with. It's like they would, put the chopped up corn in piles and then in a bunker, and then the trucks would keep driving over it to compact it, and then they'd cover it up with a tarp or something. And this is from your book. It just shows moisture levels for hay and silage. And so you can see that silage is stored at a lot higher moisture levels, between 50 and 80% or more. And hay is stored from, around between 10 and 20% moisture. And you can see the range between about 20 and 50 is unsafe for both hay or silage because it's too wet for hay but too dry for silage. So at that range, neither one of them would not be appropriate for either one. And you can see down at the bottom of the graph, storage loss is greatest in, the different types of silage, where harvest loss is greatest in hay, depending on the moisture level. Because, it's like if the hay is too dry, you're going to lose a lot during harvest. And also silage, just, it's like if you tend to maybe have at the higher, it's like there might be more storage loss at higher levels, but then, it's also necessary for the acid formation and for preserving. And then that's all I have. So if you have any questions, please let me know.